Welcome to the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. In this series, we'll bring you 12 of the best talks from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime. This episode is called Ports.
My name is Fatjona Mejdini, and I am the director of the Southeastern Europe Observatory of the Global Initiative. I will have the pleasure to moderate in the next 75 minutes these panels that focus on ports. And they are used as a crucial entry point, in fact, not only for the illicit goods, throughout the world, but also for illicit ones. It is in fact estimated that today around 80% of all goods that are traded around the world are shipped by sea, most of it in containers, entering so in ports. On the other hand, in the ports throughout the world, the biggest seizures of drugs, cigarettes, and other illicit goods have taken place. Despite this big role that ports have, there is surprisingly little research out there about illicit goods entering in ports, and the issue itself seems to be overlooked. It is believed that this gap in the research comes from the complex environment in which port operates, and also from lack of transparency of port authorities. The game becomes also more complicated in the moment when some of the key ports in the world are managed by companies of other countries, like China, United Arab Emirates, and many more. In order to shed more light on the challenges, but also opportunities on researching illicit flows coming through ports, I have the pleasure of having in this panel Ms. Anna Sergi. She's a professor of criminology and organized crime at the University of Essex in the UK. I have also Mr. Ruggero Scaturro. He's an analyst and the author of the Porthole report that was published this year by the Global Initiative. I have also with me Ms. Kristina Amerhauser. She's an analyst and program manager at Global Initiative. Welcome all. I want to remind everyone attending this panel that at the end of it, of the presentations, we're going to have around 25 or 30 minutes for questions and answers. So feel free and type in any questions that you might have for our panelists in the Q&A box, or just raise your hands and I will give you the floor to do so. So I would like to kick off with Anna, that has started to analyze ports around 5 years ago. First, her research was focused in the ports of the north of the world, and then she came to analyze the ports in the South Europe. My question to Anna, in fact, is going to be: what are some things that you have learned from this experience, and how it was this transition? What is different in issues concerning and vulnerabilities concerning ports in the north of the world and in the south of it? So, Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Fatjona, and thanks everyone. Okay, so I'm going to talk for less than 10 minutes, hopefully trying to answer these questions. So first of all, my research around ports, as Fatjona has mentioned, I have been looking at ports since 2018, but obviously in the middle there was a pandemic, so things went a little bit off track. So these are the ports I have visited, and when I say visited, I mean I've done field work in it and analyzed trafficking through it. And my research was about organized crime in ports, but not just trafficking, also corruption and other forms. You'll see there that there is a yellow port, which is Piraeus, which is the one that I'm going to touch a little bit more upon today, not just in this session, but also in a session in 2 hours or 3 hours, I forgot. And it's also what brought me to the Global Initiative. So as Fatjona has already mentioned, there's not that much out there. A lot of the research that has been done was done by colleagues early on, so some pioneering work from Damien Zeitz in the mid-2000s, looking at cocaine and Colombia and the port or the Dutch ports, then Jarineski, and then a number of other, but really we can count them on a hand. So my focus, I'm a criminologist, so my focus was about policing, it was about crime control. So that's how I approached the importation side of the north of the world and those ports in the north. I published quite extensively, but you'll see in this slide the report portholes that Ruggero is gonna talk about, because it was in that occasion last year that I got involved by, let's say, discussing methodologies and discussing how to research ports and organized crime in ports. With the Global Initiative and with Ruggero and Walter specifically for this project, and to which I contributed with the case of Piraeus. Now, the best thing about ports is ports, really. I mean, they are some amazing pieces of infrastructure and land. So I've enjoyed this research very much. And just to show you another picture, I promise I don't work for MSc. I don't know why there are so many MSc pictures. Maybe that's another question. That's Piraeus. And that was obviously for the research I mentioned. So what did I learn in the north of the world is basically the differences between global and local economic circuits when it comes to ports. So ports are at the core in the north of the world of the global trading networks and the global production network as well. They are propellers of global supply chains, and at the same time they are let's say, locations where logistic activities and cluster of production start from. So for those of you who are a little bit knowledgeable about how ports work, you might know, or you might remember that behind a port, there is always a dry port, sometimes more than one, which is basically where all the logistic activities happen, but sometimes also cluster of production. So when we look at ports, we can't forget where we are at. So the fact that my first ports, were in the north of the world meant looking at certain types of economic regimes, specifically capitalist regimes, and how does that shape the territorial and national institutional framework. And obviously different models of capitalism, I don't want to go into much details for that, create certain path dependencies. We've seen it with ports, apart from crime, we've seen it what happens when something like the Evergreen gets stuck in the Suez Canal, or we've seen the supply chain problems during the pandemic or during the Ukraine war. So obviously there is a path dependency of the whole world on ports, and this very much affects different places depending on which model of capitalism is institutionalized in those frameworks. When it comes to organized crime, on the importation side, organized crime is conditioned by ports. It's not the other way around. They can't choose most of the things we attribute them to choose. There is a condition of opportunism, which depends on the success of trade, whether they are trading something licit or illicit. So sometimes we assume that organized crime group can make certain decisions based on their own convenience, but really it is about the resilience of a certain shipment route, whether or not there is a route that connects two different ports, and whether or not that route is resilient and will ensure the longevity of the illicit trade. So to give you an example with Piraeus, we had a very clear boost in the cocaine trade in Piraeus because of a new route that was established between the port of Guayaquil in Ecuador and Piraeus directly before touching Rotterdam. So that obviously moves to Piraeus an awful lot of stuff that went to Rotterdam and then goes from Piraeus to Rotterdam on a feeder, but obviously the container are better dealt with in Piraeus. So this changes quite a bit of the capacity of organized crime group. So the capacity of criminal networks to adapt to abrupt changes, obviously, is very different. We have ports in the north where organized crime groups might be more able to, let's say, organize the trafficking, but then they need cooperation and coordination when it comes to handling the logistics. One case above all is the UK, where obviously the trafficking happens mostly from Europe. And when it comes through British ports, it is handled basically elsewhere and not in the UK itself. different from Piraeus, for example, where the criminal networks are way more adapted to abrupt changes. The Balkan route is there to essentially support a certain type of logistics already, and is actually what prompts the groups to use the Piraeus in the first place. The ability of local and global actors to enter certain businesses. Obviously, we found cases in the north of the world, in Montreal or New York City, where the port workforce has been developing around extra forms of extra legal governance. The stories of the Port of New York are and the mob, let's say the mob, are famous, but obviously these need to be taken in the context of today. While in other parts of the world there is different types of informality that do not lead to those type of extra legal governance, but might lead to more distributed form of governance, where port workers might support organized crime without being, compelled to do so or intimidated into doing so. And then last but not least, the resources and capabilities of law enforcement. Obviously, this is something that we have to consider. Port security is increasing. That does not mean that crime cross-border is decreasing. Actually, quite the opposite. Port security in the north of the world definitely displaces crime, and it is displacing it to the south of the world by founding counterintuitive routes. So this is part of our lesson learned. And then I'm going to leave you with this food for thought. Illicit trafficking is different from criminal governance in ports. They both might be pursued by different groups. This is what we found from the north and the south. Port security is not about organized crime, but mostly about displacement and safety. And this is something in the south of the world is felt a lot different than in the north. And what the Piraeus and the GI-TOC study add to the rest of my research? Definitely the Balkan route, so the focus on the movement and the logistics. A lot of reflection on counterintuitive paths of drug trade, which I'm going to talk about in the next panel as well. And obviously different type of policing and security challenges in a different security milieu, which is the one of Greece within Europe, but also next to the Balkans. And I'm going to stop here. I hope I was in time, more or less between my 50 minutes. Thank you very much. And over to you, Fatjona.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your presentation, but also for the support that you have given to the global initiative in researching organized crime in the Southeastern Europe ports. In fact, there are some comments that already are in, and then when we finish all the presentations, I will give you the space to take the floor and also comment and also do your remark, and also you have the chance to pose directly questions to the panelists. In fact, Ruggero Scaturro, my colleague at the Global Initiative that we have today with us, have been one of the authors of the Porthole report that it was published during the summer of this year. And it was, in fact, one of the very first reports that try to shed more light and to explore the maritime route in the south of Europe. Ruggero is going to present right now to bring us some of the findings, but also conclusions of this very important study. Ruggero, over to you.
Thank you very much. As said briefly about myself, I'm an analyst at the Global Initiative. I specifically work in the observatory of the focusing on Southeastern Europe. And so to give you a little bit of background information, given the news coming from North European ports, so Rotterdam, Antwerp, all these ports have been under the analysis. And also given the involvement sometimes of Western Balkan criminal networks in this police operation, we actually started looking at the region and had a look actually at what was going on. These, as you can see here displayed in the map, are all customs and police operations in our regional ports. So seizures of illicit substances that were hidden in containers. So after looking at the quantities seized and also analyzing police operations in general, annual police reports, we then realized actually how important ports, and specifically here container terminals, are in the illicit flows to and through our region of reference, and so decided basically to develop this organized crime and corruption risk assessment of the ports that you can see here identified. Now, before getting to this final list of the case studies, plus the Danube that my colleague Kristina is gonna discuss right after me. So before coming up with this final list, you can see ports listed under the flags. We actually have conducted a preliminary assessment study on more than 20 ports in the region, with the goal of selecting exactly this final list. So the analysis was based on 4 main criteria that we then combined. First of all, we looked at the port ownership. So we assessed whether the port was either public or private. And it was also the case that the ports were all actually both private and public, for example, in the case of Bar. Then we also looked at the size of the port, meaning we had a look at the trade volume and specifically the number of containers which are handled per year, so the number of TEU, 20-foot equivalent units. Then we also wanted to assess the relevance of the role that the port plays from a commercial perspective by looking at the connectivity of the port, not only from a maritime perspective, so meaning to how many other ports a specific port under analysis was connected, but also from a land infrastructure perspective, meaning if the port was then connected via land to specific other land infrastructure, railroads, train station, free trade zone, dry ports, highways, and so on and so forth. And also we wanted to, as a 4th criterion, we wanted also to factor in the sort of criminological element. So we had a look at the history of seizures of illicit goods in container terminals. So we basically here excluded also all those seizures that were actually taking place outside the container terminal, so in passage and terminal and so on. So as one of the results of the study and the field work we have conducted, we also wanted to give our own understanding and categorization of regional ports, also from a chronological perspective, meaning based on how and also why actually illicit trade manifest in port premises. As you can see here, there are 3 main categories of ports: the trade giants, the crime magnates, and the safe havens. Here, before getting into the details of each category, I also wanted to stress here that these categories are not exclusive, not independent from each other. Actually, the categorization is also not, so to say, engraved in stone, because it just reflects, it is the outcome of the study that we have conducted between November 2021 and February 2022, meaning that it might be that over then the months that came after, it might also be that specific changes, either in the security level provided by law enforcement authorities, or maybe specific enlargements, for instance, of the commercial area of the port. It might be that nowadays, port, for example, Constanza, let's say, would actually better fit the trade giants and vice versa. Now, this said, as you can see, Piraeus, and I'm not gonna say much because it's been already pretty much addressed also by Anna, it is the only trade giant, and this has to do definitely, of course, with the high level of throughputs, especially after the acquisition of COSCO. And as a huge port in general with millions of containers, Piraeus attracts in a way many different illicit substances coming from a very big as well variety of sources. In fact, Piraeus, also in the narrative of the media in general, doesn't really characterize for any particular drug seized. It's not the port of cocaine, it's not the port of cigarettes, it's not the port of heroin. It's actually the port of many of these. From a criminogenic perspective, then in general, large ports, and Piraeus is one of these, have a very complex and multi-stakeholder security system in place, and which in a way make it sometimes also rather complex to keep up with the fast and large stream of containers. Costanza, Koper, Rijeka, Ploce, and Thessaloniki fall instead into the crime magnet category. These ports actually do not have great throughputs and are not particularly large also in terms of size, and yet their geographical location, which is often a transport intersection, make them particularly important for both national and also international trade. Take, for instance, the role that played by the port of Koper for landlocked countries based companies, for example, Austria and Hungary, or Ploce for the Bosnian market, as well as Thessaloniki for North Macedonia and Western Bulgaria. Now, for the same reasons which attract legit interests of business companies that want to have an access to seaborne transport. Criminal network of especially, of course, not just, but especially landlocked countries actually are particularly attracted to this port, and hence the magnet definition. In fact, we have actually observed the presence of, for instance, of Serbs operating in both Rijeka and Constanza, or for instance, North Macedonian-based criminal networks operating in Thessaloniki, and so on and so forth. The last category is safe havens, and in this category there are Bar, Durrës, and Varna. By safe havens, we mean facilities, so port in general, port premises that for their specific characteristics are particularly exposed to criminal activity. And in the context of our analysis, we have observed actually two main aspects that strongly, in a way, characterize this port. First of all, the presence of organized crime groups traditionally operating in the city close or where actually the port is located, with also the possibility, it's actually the most important thing, the possibility to access the port thanks to legit businesses. Sometimes, for instance, in the case of Durrës, we have observed that arrested members of a local powerful clan were actually, at the time of being arrested, they were found in possession also of badges that would let them inside the port, for example, because they were operating logistics companies, or they were actually also involved in the fisheries and so on. And the second aspect, I would say, factor is also the systemic lack of security and pervasive corruption, and also money laundering schemes that we have observed, particularly when assessing the board of management of the port of Varna. And sometimes it's actually up to the point that it suggests some sort of like ports capture. So it's literally in the hand of criminal consortium. Now, very briefly here, this is just some of the international drug flows, actually illicit good flows that we have identified during the study. We started, of course, from the seizures and built these vectors going backwards. You can see, of course, cocaine coming from Latin American ports, both in the Pacific and the Atlantic, going not only to Western Europe, but also to our region of reference. We have cigarettes traditionally being shipped from Chinese ports as well as ports of the Emirates. And then, of course, we have heroin that is produced in Afghanistan and it reaches our region either through the Gulf of Aden, Djibouti, Suez, and then up, or actually across land through Iran and Turkey, and then accessing our region through the ports of Varna and Constanza. This is just a close-up of basically a more detailed map, of course, with our regional reference zoomed. The only detail that I wish here to highlight is the fact that we have identified actually in the heroin route. As you can see, there is the yellow one that crosses the Black Sea. This is the one that I was referring to before, but there is actually an additional one that wasn't present in the previous slide. So heroin being shipped from the southern coast of Turkey, Mersin and Iskenderun mainly, that circumnavigates the Balkan Peninsula and enter the region, but also European Union, so Western Europe at one of its Northern Adriatic ports, which is in fact Koper. And hence actually here, this is where also the title of our reports originates, so exploring the Maritime Balkan Routes, because traditionally the Balkan route is associated with, of course, with land. So from Turkey across Bulgaria, Serbia, going northwest. Now, this is a visual that we are particularly proud of. In a way, it summarizes all the consideration that we have collected when visiting the ports. It consists of a made-up port, of course, with components, though, which are rather common in many of the ports that we have analyzed. And to each number components item corresponds, of course, a specific vulnerability that we have identified. And you can find also all the specific descriptions in the dedicated section of the report. Very briefly here, I might talk about the scanners. Of course, there are mobile and fixed scanners. Mobile ones are probably the best because they can be brought everywhere in the port. But in the region, we have observed that most of them are actually fixed. And in a specific case, again, the port of Durrës, I'm sorry if there's any local here, but we have observed, for instance, that the fixed scanners were located rather far away from the loading zone of the container terminal. And usually heavily loaded trucks would need up to 20 minutes to get there, also going in between, I would say, remote areas also of the port, also in between containers piled up, all areas which are not covered also by CCTV cameras, so spaces that offer, in a way, time and space to potential offenders to tamper with the container. very briefly, we had a look also at the concealment methods. We have identified a number of methods to hide basically the drugs and in general illicit goods inside containers. There's many. There are, for example, the most commonly identified in the region is the hide and seek, which basically consists of replacing goods, for example, tropical fruits, let's say a box of banana, just to refer to the most common one, the most common fruits, basically taking out of the box some bananas and then replacing and filling them with cocaine or illicit goods in general. There are other methods we have identified, for instance, the rip-on rip-off, which is basically breaking open the container, taking out some box carrying legit goods and replacing them with drugs or illicit substances in general, and then basically reclosing it and put a fake custom seal. But of course, moving forward, also criminal networks are also in a way trying to always identify sophisticated methods, more sophisticated methods over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruggero, for your presentation and sharing with us these important findings, but also these cool graphics. It is interesting, in fact, because you spoke about some issues that some ports in Southeast Europe have with scanners. But I just want to share something that I learned when I was a few weeks ago in Ecuador, and especially in Guayaquil, which is the biggest port city of this country. While interviewing somebody from the port authority, I just learned that out of the 6 ports in Ecuador, only in one of them there was actually a scanner. So of course, there are endless problem, and also I think that some of the comments here also mention the fact that in fact the ports in the south of the world are also big contributors to this illicit goods that they later on comes in the part of the world, and this is why this is a very complicated issues in order not just to study but also to tackle. Very often when we speak about ports, instantly what we think are seaports, but we often forget the importance of the river ports as well. When starting researching criminality in the ports of the Southeastern Europe, we realized that in fact the Danube River ports had a very big role, and there were many cases of illicit goods being found in these ports. And what was more shocking, it was that in fact the most seizures were done by accident. My colleague Kristina Amerhauser, she was working closely, in fact, with Ruggero and Anna for this report, but she had a special focus on the ports on the Danube River. So Kristina, over to you to tell us a little bit more about vulnerabilities and really what is happening in the Danube ports.
Thank you very much, Fatjona. Thanks for the introduction and for the invitation to join this panel and speak a little bit more about the Danube. And so I was thinking that after sort of listening to Anna speaking about the role of ports globally, and then Ruggero really focusing on maritime container ports in Southeastern Europe, that I would speak a little bit more about the Danube, its ports, but also its role for smuggling in Southeastern Europe more broadly. I think there are several key differences to the seaports in Southeastern Europe that Ruggero outlined, but I think it complements the bigger picture of the role of ports and organized crime in the region. Actually, I wanted to start quickly by looking at research linked between rivers and organized crime globally. And it appears that there's very little research done into the role of rivers and natural geography in general. A review of academic literature that a colleague of mine conducted has provided limited results. We think that he actually identified a gap in research around the world. That's quite surprising, given that rivers provide ideal conditions for smuggling and illicit trade. Rivers are 23% of the world's international boundaries. They connect urban trading centers and therefore also criminal markets, and they can often be accessed at remote locations. these remote locations are also difficult to access. They're also under-policed and provide opportunities for organized criminal groups. It's actually complicated to police rivers throughout their length. The Danube specifically is Europe's second largest river, connecting 10 countries from Germany to the Black Sea. It acts as a border river between Bulgaria and Romania, or Serbia and Romania, to mention just examples. Only its first 170 kilometers are navigable by larger ocean ships, but the Danube hosts more than 96 ports, which are mostly accessed by barges and passenger boats. And it links to the Rhine-Main waterway, building a connection between the port of Hamburg and the port of Constanza through the heart of Europe, really. In our research, we found that there's been very little attention on the Danube. Water level fluctuations make it difficult to transport, especially perishable goods. In contrast to some of the seaports that Ruggero was talking about, that where investment in ports and infrastructure has been really improving over the past couple of years. Investment in infrastructure in the Danube port continues to be slow, making it often unattractive for businesses. There are few connections to train tracks, for example, or highways, making it difficult to move the cargo. And there are few container ships, but as I mentioned, goods are mostly transported in barges. The goods are mostly fertilizer, iron ore, and similar goods. And there only appear to be a limited number of shipping companies, and those that are active are reported to know each other well, which is also quite unique along the river. Despite the lack of attention and actually the limited number of goods and companies active along the Danube, there seems to be a free flow for smuggling activities. There's no integrated security management along the Danube. There's a security concept in the Danube Commission, but there appears to be little operational cooperation. And as Fatjona also mentioned in her introduction, seizures appear to happen by accident. Here on the map, we've put a couple of these examples of drug seizures that were recorded along the Danube. For example, in 2006, more than a ton of cannabis was discovered in Vienna, or in March 2019, more than a ton of cocaine capsized in the Danube Delta. Another incident was in November 2021, where more than 57 million untaxed cigarettes were seized on a Ukrainian barge in Hungary during a routine inspection. And yeah, so the fact that goods are moved in barges and not in containers also makes it quite difficult to check and control the ship. In many cases, in order to really perform a thorough check, you would have to unload the cargo, which is both time consuming and actually logistically challenging or even impossible because the infrastructure is not available. And some of the people that we spoke to last year admitted that practically everything can be transported in barges because only papers or seals are being reviewed. So yeah, just to conclude, I wanted to highlight some of the key findings and takeaways that we had, and that is that really there's been very limited attention on the Danube, and that capacity to control the river appears to be weak. There are limited joint law enforcement operations, and those that are quite isolated. But focus on the Danube should not only be put on smuggling and trafficking operations, but illicit activity also includes such things as fuel theft, smuggling of migrants, or even piracy, because from 2007 to 2008, more than 40 vessels were attacked by organized criminal groups in Bulgaria and Serbia, not to steal the cargo, but also the equipment of the ships, forcing shipping companies to hire security firms. We believe that there is quite a high potential and risk that the Danube is used more broadly to smuggle goods. the incident that I was talking about before, the 1.3 tons of cocaine seizure in the Danube Delta, was likely not the first time that the criminal group used this route to transport cocaine. And on the way forward, we think that it might also be important to keep an eye out for waste smuggling. There's evidence that this is happening already through Black Sea ports, and its interconnectedness with the Danube deserves closer attention. Ports along the Danube might also serve as crime magnets, places that Ruggero was talking about would really attract criminality because of their vulnerable governance, geographical position, and lack of law enforcement attention. But more information and research are needed into the topic to confirm this. And the Danube might also be particularly important at the moment, as it's the border river from Romania to Ukraine, and the role that it can potentially play for organized crime and the displacement since the beginning of the war. So I'll stop here and back to you, Fatjona.
Thank you very much, Kristina, for your presentation. It's really interesting one because, as I said, like the rivers, the river ports in Danube, they are overlooked, and now with the war in Ukraine, also this takes another importance because of the smuggling that might occur. One question, in fact, that we have comes from Jennifer Salahab, and I think it's a very interesting one. She asked about the role of stevedores or the longshoremen in facilitating organized crime operation at ports. So I don't know which from the panelists want to take the floor. Anna, yes, over to you.
I can go on this just so that I can then leave the other more difficult ones to Ruggero. Okay, so stevedores and longshoremen have long been associated with corruption in ports, right? So that's what we often see, and sometimes mostly the news that tell, especially I'm just thinking about Italy. A few days ago, there have been over 35 people arrested, 14 of which were port workers in Gioia So the situation is not that applicable everywhere, but there are a few points that I would like to raise in terms of longshoremen and port workers more generally and illicit trade. First of all, the job of port workers has been historically, specifically intergenerational. So it's a job that is often passed on by grandfather to father to son, a heavily masculine job for reasons that have to do with the actual type of job that is done, the perception of risk, physical risk and safety. So this creates a little bit of a silos community, an enclave of community that in some occasions has led also to reciprocal immunity from time to time. There have been many instances. I'm thinking of the port of Melbourne in the 80s, New York before that, Liverpool, for example, where dock workers were found to have created a system in place whereby they would just protect one another in the criminal activities. But more recently, I think things are a little bit more confused in the sense that you do have corruption, of course. You do have, as research has also shown us since the 2000s, some port workers who want to be involved. You have also port workers who are intimidated into getting involved, or who get involved because others are involved and therefore they feel like the sense of immunity is reciprocal. But more crucially, because of the nature of trade, and we're talking here about, I'm specifically talking here about massive seaports, right? So seaports like the giants one, the Piraeus, Montreal, New York, you don't actually need any illicit commodity to be taken on the actual terminal. It's actually much better for the criminal group if the commodity just goes through undetected. So the role of the port worker there is to share the know-how and to sell the know-how and to sell his eyes on the actual terminal to see, essentially to explain and to make sure that the people on the other side know what is going on and how the terminal works and whether or not something is moving strangely. We saw in some cases port workers having the ability to facilitate the speedness, the velocity in which a container leaves the port. So these kind of things are a little bit more specific and contextual, depending on each port. So we can't really assume. Plus, more and more, we are seeing different type of payments and different type of rewards when it comes to port workers. So it's not just about getting corrupted and getting money. It's about getting drugs sometimes and then entering the drug trade or being in the drug trade in another way. It's about different types of career rewards. So it's a lot more complicated, and it's very much about the context as well.
Thanks, Anna.
If I may add on this, just to elaborate on this, it is in fact, especially when in the context of so in the context of also understanding the role of longshoremen, I would say that their role is definitely important in that sense that Anna's just explained, but also, and this is actually why we have extended in a way our analysis and our also assessment also of all those places that in a way also connected to the port. And here, in fact, I'm talking about all those employees that work, for instance, in wholesale markets. If you have a container which is coming to the port and then has to go direct to the wholesale market because certain bags of fruits have to be taken and are actually destined for the local market, these are all considerations have to be taken into account. So it's not just about longshoremen, but also all those workers that in a way contribute to the supply chain of transport of goods.
Okay, thanks, Ruggero. In fact, we have another questions from Antonio Sampaio. Sorry for the pronunciation. It's not always easy to pronounce names from across the world, but yeah, we are trying. In fact, Antonio has 3 questions in one. I'm going to read those loud, and please feel free, any of the panelists, to take some of these questions. How does organized crime through ports relate to urban insecurity governance? Do OC groups choose cities that present opportunities for territorial control, corruption, where they have a presence? And the third question is, does transnational trafficking through ports affect the urban security? Anna?
I go first, so it's always easy when you go first. It's a fantastic question, and knowing where Antonio is coming from in terms of research makes a lot of sense. This is part of my research, actually, to try and understand the relationship of the city port, essentially in the port city, which is not the same in every place. So the question is to understand what Antonio is asking, to what extent organized crime group who have a presence in the territory are also able to use or will want to be able to use the port for their own business. And we really here risk to be taken from those cases in the world that actually constitute a minority. So it's a minority of cases where you can have an organized crime group in a city acting out on control and territorial control through corruption within the port or through hiring practices within the port, and using that for transnational activities. It's actually very, very specific. And obviously the obvious case here is the one of Gioia Tauro, the port in Calabria, where the 'Ndrangheta's clans, the local clans have heavily invested in, and then invested in the hiring practices to the point of bankrupting the port, and eventually also invested in the illicit trade of cocaine, which benefits the clan on the other side. But this is actually an exception. We do see, however, that there is also, for example, in the south of the world, I was recently in Cartagena, visiting the port. Cartagena starting a project with some colleagues there, and what we could see there is that, especially in the past, it wasn't just about willing to settle in a specific area because that area had a port that was eventually interesting from a trafficking perspective, but also it was kind of a more organic situation where the groups had already settled there because that place being a port hub and a trade hub also meant being able to trade more. So it's the port that drives the organized crime group, not the other way around. The organized crime group, as I said before, are conditioned by opportunities. They can't just pick and choose most of the time, especially when there is someone else already there in terms of organized crime. And this does affect urban security, even if not in a direct way. To finish off my comments, I did engage with a project on urban security in Piraeus to see whether Piraeus has felt the increasing volume of trade in the port, also in the city, whether the city has become unsafe, the city of Piraeus, the municipality of Piraeus, not Athens, has become unsafe because of the port. And the answer is no. The answer is no. However, when we look at urban security beyond the street and in a sort of like community engineering, then we might change our idea. But I guess I don't want to go too much into details on that. But Antonio, if you are interested, you know where to find me and we can discuss it more.
Thanks, Anna. Ruggero, Kristina, do you have something to add on Antonio's questions?
Just that from evidence-based actually answer is that the only scenario in which we have observed something similar is definitely the port of Durrës. And in general, all those ports that fall into the category that was referring to the safe havens, these are the ports that for one reason or another fall inside, again, the area of influence of a given specific organized crime groups. And particularly in Durrës, we have observed definitely a strong link between the activities of the illicit activities in the ports and also in general the sense of insecurity in the surroundings. Also, given the strong role that the port plays for the city as such.
Thanks, Ruggero. Kristina, maybe you want to add something?
I can just add a little bit actually from the port of Koper that I've been also involved in researching. And there, the port of Koper, we've identified really as sort of the beating heart of the area. Everything seems to be evolving around the port in one way or another. The amount of jobs it creates and services and products for the Slovenian economy. But at the same time, it's actually very well connected to the other markets, not in Slovenia itself, but also to Italy. It's well connected to Austria, Hungary, etc. So it's the organized crime is also moving goods through the port very quickly, and it's very much connected not to local organized crime, but to the regional economy. And so, yeah.
Thanks, Kristina. We have another question, in fact, from the anonymous attendee. Probably somebody has forgot to register with their name. But in fact, it's quite interesting questions concerning the role of ports as key instruments within the globalization of crime. The question is, which are nowadays the most important issues and challenges that policymakers have to deal with? Which are the most active ports to these concerns? Maybe we just follow the tradition. We start with Anna and then...
I like this tradition. Yes. Okay. Right. So I think, ports and the port system, the port economy actually is the most liberal form of liberal economy that we have. Is the capitalism at its purest form, with less and less controls, with overarching system of coordination, but essentially it is the purest form of capitalism. So in that sense, for all the literature that looks at globalization and crime being a product of capitalism, essentially of radical capitalism, ports are essential means to that. So the port economy, and especially in a specific time of the port economy, which is the advent of containerization, which happened around the 70s, which essentially meant that you didn't have to have that many people working port and unpacking things from the ship. You could have ships moving in tonnages, and a new unit measure had to be created for the amount of volume of things that could be transported. then obviously it means it's the essence of globalization, is the interconnectedness of communication, of economics, finance market. And ports themselves are more connected to one another than they are to their cities. To, again, give you an example from an obvious example, the port of Gioia Tauro is way more connected to Genova than it is to the city of Rosarno, which is behind it. So the ways in which ports communicate with each other is globalized in itself. So the most important issues and challenges, the problem is that ports cannot be, they can be harmonized, the policies for countering crime, but that is an harmonization that has to come voluntarily. There is no way in which the international community can legislate on ports around the world. And there is no way either in which we can have a one-size-fits-all. We do have, and we haven't mentioned it today, but we do have several maritime security international tools. We do have actually security tools, the ISPS code, which is a security tool that came after 9/11, which is supposed to harmonize security on the port terminal and make sure that there is similar language. Most ports have to adopt that for their international, let's say, because they are adhering to international tools. However, the ways in which they actually, in practice, these codes are actually applied, there is a lot of scope for informality and gray area. So I think the problem is that we still have extremely national maritime regulation in the most unnational, the most global of a port of economics. So it's absolutely unbelievable to me how we don't have European legislation on this, at least, for regions. But the real issue here is that you do have some ports that are more active than others. The US overall is extremely active at the point of actually sending people to check on ports abroad, to actually have container controls abroad if something is coming into the US. But this only creates what in criminology we call criminogenic asymmetries. If someone does too much and someone does not enough, then you have a problem.
Okay, Kristina?
No, just very quickly, I wanted to add to something that Anna mentioned, because we've also observed the along the Danube sort of the interconnectedness between Austria and Germany, for example, was much between the ports and the agencies involved was much better than between Austria and some of the Western Balkan countries. So we've identified that there's definitely a lot of scope for improvement. And as Anna mentioned, it very much depends on the individual case, on the agency involved, on the country involved. Within the EU, there's much better cooperation than outside of EU countries.
Thanks, Kristina. And the questions, in fact, they keep coming. It seems that there's a lot of interest on ports, and this is why more research probably is needed in this regard. We have two questions from Marina in the chat box. She asks, when you talk about police controls, are those ones additional to the Orange Channel and the Red Channel controls? And the second question is about the methodology of the research. Is yours quality research, or does it involve any kind of quantity data managing? And I think that here, Marina, you are referring to the portholes reports, the analyzing of the ports in Southeastern Europe. Anna?
Yes. So police control in ports is done nationally and locally. So each port will have several layers of control that we call police, but essentially means crime control. And these are at the local level. Sometimes you have special squads from the local police, municipal police, or state police, depending where you are, which might have a special unit for the port. Sometimes you have task forces between local police and, let's say, national police or federal police, depending again where you are, and some other times you might have a top-bottom approach where the federal police or the national police might want to have special units for the ports sent from elsewhere, which does not touches on the city at all. So that's police. There is no such a thing as police in the sense of international policing, which is another problem. There might be, in some cases, some roles given to coast guards, which in some countries more than others, like in Greece, they do have some elements of anti-drug systems. But generally speaking, police means essentially analyzing everything outside of ports that leads to making arrests or disruption of drug flows within ports or through ports. So most of the time, police work does not happen in the port at all. It happens elsewhere through intelligence gathering that as the port as a center. And to talk about the randomness, about 3 up to 5% of containers are checked ever in each port. So it's really, you never count, no one counts on random searches. Random searches are just luck strikes. And yes, the research, my research at least, has always been qualitative. I wouldn't do it any other way. And yeah, so looking at data that has already been, number data that has already been done by others is just the beginning of research in my case.
Thanks, Anna. Ruggero, do you want to speak a little bit about the methodology of the report?
Yeah, no, starting from the second question, yes, as well, we relied on qualitative methods, absolutely. And regarding also the first question, I just wanted to add very, very briefly that most of the seizures, of course, that we have studied and analyzed in the regional ports that we have identified in our study, they were 9 out of 10 the result, of course, of information sharing between law enforcement authorities, often between the authorities of a transit port, be it in Spain or very likely almost was often the case also Italian customs as well. They were communicating the sort of like red flagging some specific shipments. So it was always, so the randomness, as Anna said, it's you cannot rely on that because the numbers are too high. So whenever, especially in big busts, talking about hundreds of kilograms of whatever illicit substance, it's only thanks to international cooperation between law enforcement on a bilateral basis, very often the case.
And this comes from Giulia Romano, and I think it's a very interesting one. She asks, how does corruption manifest itself within the port system? How and how much does corruption affect security levels within ports? Anna, over to you.
Corruption depends on which corruption we're talking about. If we're talking about individual corruption and people being paid to do something illegal, that's one thing. There is another type of corruption, which is being paid to do your job in a way that is actually facilitating an illicit actor. And then there is systemic corruption, which obviously means that your activity contributes to a system in which everyone does the same or a little bit of the same for an overall corrupted activity. So corruption in port is at every level. It's just more difficult to identify. It's at the level of corporation. There are some very shady complications when you try and look at the role of shipping companies and the agreements the shipping company make with certain, let's say, owners of ports. But then the way down, the role of customs, which is always a little bit problematic because customs have, in most ports, are the only one who are actually able and enabled to open containers and to actually seize stuff that is illegally there. So to corrupt custom officers is actually extremely important in some cases. And in some other cases, obviously, corruption stops at the basic level, which is port workers or checkers or other people with lower level and lower impact. So I think that the issue here, corruption manifests like in every system when you have the possibility to change the course of action. Corruption can only work if you have discretion. So identifying who has discretion in a port, and each port might be slightly different in terms of action, will give you some vulnerabilities. If customs are the one who open the containers and customs can, let's say, walk alone or have certain type of other capacity, then you'll have customs being the ones that, if corrupted, will, I don't use the word infect, but will affect security levels with imports. But security levels in this case are about the recording of illicit activities and how much illicit activities are actually understood as such. So it's an interesting question, but definitely the key word here, I think, is that which type of corruption, in the sense of does it require an action or an inaction from the persons, and more importantly, whether or not this can lead to an illicit activity or let's say an oversight. And I think then you have plenty of different opportunities there. But I know that maybe Ruggero will want to say something.
No, just some evidence from the study. We have observed many different forms, many different acts of corruption. Of course, depending as well on the ports under analysis. These ranges from petty corruption, so meaning just bribery of little amount of money, to longshoremen or to private security employees that are in charge of securing certain parts or whatever warehouses, both inside and actually outside ports. But we have also observed some instances of more institutionalized, also grand corruption. When it came, for example, we have observed money laundering schemes when observing the operations of the Board of Management of the Port of Varna. We have some sort of also like institutionalized systemic, I would say, forms of corruption affecting certain parts of the port of Bar that we have observed. So it really depends, I would say, on the port under analysis, and also, of course, on the actors that are included. So to each actor, I would say, correspond a specific action to be done or taken and performed, actually not to be performed, as Anna was pointing out.
Thank you. Kristina, maybe you want to add something about when you researched copper ports, but also the Danube Rivers one?
Thanks, Fatjona. I think most information that Ruggero and Anna shared is also true for copper, actually. And when it comes to the Danube, we simply don't know enough about it yet. We need to conduct more research and need more information. So I'm sorry, I can't add more at this point.
Thank you. So with here now we have also Walter Kemp. He's one of the author, in fact, of the Portholes report that was published with us. It was published this year together with Ruggero. Walter, in fact, due to some other activities, couldn't not present, but it seems that he has a question, and in this session of Q&As, I gave Walter the right to talk. Maybe, Walter, you could tell us a little bit, how was your experience as an author in analyzing the ports of Southeastern Europe? And also you could ask the participants if they could help you with your question about the headquarters of Aquapol. Walter?
Thanks, Fatjona. And I actually just put the question in the chat to make you smile, but I'm sorry I couldn't be on the call. I was traveling. This report was really interesting for us in so many different ways, not least because of the methodology. And all the people on this panel were so instrumental in making it possible. I also very much encourage anyone who's interested in the topic to watch the video, have a look at the visualization when it comes out, read the report. It, I think, breaks ground not only on what we found in Southeastern Europe, but which could be applied to other parts of the world. My question was, where's the headquarters of Aquapol? Because we went to talk to the water police in Austria, and they mentioned that there's not only Europol and Interpol, there's something called Aquapol, but we never found it. So the search continues. Okay,
thank you, Walter. If somebody in this panel or from the attendees has some information about Aquapol, please tell us. I first want to thank the panelists, but also the attendees, because this was really a very interactive session, and I have enjoyed very much. Thank you all. and hope to see you in other events of Global Initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. This talk was just one of 85 from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime. To get access to the rest, head over to oc24.heysummit.com. Thanks for listening.